Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com. This video is going to be another in my series of practice sessions for the Red Hat Certified Specialist in Containers exam EX188. Before I dive in, I want to thank returning subscribers for watching another video, as well as invite anyone who hasn't subscribed yet to click the subscribe button. And if you enjoy the video, make sure that you click like. I do want to remind everyone that these are practice sessions. It's my opportunity to go through some of the objectives and try to explain them and try to do some examples of functionally what the objective needs in order to self-assess before my exam. My exam is 2 weeks from tomorrow. And so this gives me some time, if I don't feel confident about a particular objective, to go back and brush up before the exam. These are not tutorials, nor are they intended to be training materials, but if you are also preparing for this exam, this might give you some ideas of how to practice some of the objectives. Also, one other thing to note, unlike RHCSA and RHCE, these don't seem to be tied to a particular version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, even though I think this exam is going to be on RHEL 8. I'm doing my practice on RHEL 8, and these practice sessions are happening in February of 2024. So if you find this video, years in the future and EX188 is still around, just keep that in mind. What I am practicing might be different than the objectives on the exam then. So we're going to continue in the implement images using Podman set of objectives. And in this video, I'm going to look at understand and use WORKDIR and USER instructions, and also understand security related topics. I'm a bit critical of some of the objectives for this exam. One is the understand security related topics. That's a pretty wide breadth of things. I mean, you can have entire career paths in quote security. And so I think what this is talking about is understanding the idea of rootless containers, because I know that's a big thing for Podman, the fact that it supports rootless containers, and also understanding the relationship between the processes and the users of the container versus the process on the actual host, understanding what user is owning what process. So there may be more stuff related to security with containers. If you have other ideas, feel free to put those in the comments. I'm sure anyone watching this would like to get some more ideas about it, but I think this is focusing on rootless containers, or at least I hope it is, because that's how I'm planning on approaching it. So starting with WORKDIR and user instructions, let me go to the terminal, and we are going to pull down a couple of images. I'm going to pull down good old UBI and the HTTPD image. You would think I've done this enough times that I have the fully qualified image names memorized, but alas, I do not. Expand my terminal a bit there, and we'll grab UBI 8. I don't want the minimal, mainly because I want to have access to DNF. So we'll go ahead and pull that down. Podman pull. That way we kind of front load the pulling of the image. And we're also going to get the HTTPD image as well. I'm choosing to pull from registry.redhat.com so I don't have to authenticate to it. But I could do registry.redhat.io as well. And we'll pull down that image. All right, let's start with UBI. So these instructions are, or rather these directives, the WORKDIR and the user directive, are significant to container files as far as building your image. So we'll start a container file. We'll do from the UBI image. I'm going to do a run command. I'm going to create a user, and we'll let that be it for the image right now. So we'll just create test user once. Let me build this. Podman build -t. We'll call this user test 1. All right, so we have our first little image here, and if I were to run this, even though I've made a user test user 1, that is not going to be the user that is running this particular image. I haven't given the image any type of instruction saying, hey, when you are launching your application within the container, run it as a particular user. Instead, it's going to be running as root, which is how the original image was built. And we can confirm this a couple different ways. One, I'm just going to run an image. I'm just going to run the image. We'll have it vanish after we're finished. User test 1 latest, and we're just going to run the ID command. I could do who am I as well. So we run the container on the image, and we know that it would be running as the root user. Another way, I believe, to know that is to take a look at the image itself using Podman inspect. User test 1, I'll pipe this to JQ. I think this will be under config. Let's see. If not, we'll look at the entire image. I'm going to have to look at the entire image for this. Clear the screen. It should tell us, should's famous last words in IT, right? Should tell us the user. Actually, it's not. Okay, probably what's happening here, there's no official user specified, so it's assumed to just run as root, which would kind of make sense. Now, if I wanted, we can dictate that from this point on, with your container image, all commands that would be run in the image, when you're building it, if I had more run statements and such, they would be in the context of test user 1, and then whatever your entry point or command that you have configured in your image for your container to execute will also be in the context of whatever user you have specified with the user directive. So let's build our image again. This time I'm going to call it test. I'll call the other one user test. Give it user test 1. I call it user test 2. We'll just go sequentially here. We see there was another step, and that made another layer on the image. So now if I were to Podman run rm user test 2 and do the ID command, it's now returning test user 1. So that's really kind of all there is to dictating the user. You can kind of go back and forth. Let's say that, or actually this container file is sort of a good example of this. Let me cat that out real quick. Test user 1 is not a privileged user, so I'm still in the context of the root user for this run user add test user 1. Then I change. If I wanted to, I could change back. I could do user root and do more commands, and then go back to user test user 1. One thing to keep in mind is that would create some more layers in the image, and we want to try to keep our images as lean as possible. So one thing to keep in mind for that. The other directive that we're going to look at is the WORKDIR directive, and it's kind of similar to how the user directive is. It changes the directory context that you're working in. So let me give you an example of this. Let me go back to our container file, and what I want to do is, now that we're running as test user 1, we're going to run echo. Here is a test file, and we're going to output that to home test. You can probably hear the fan of my laptop spinning up here. Home test user 1 test.txt. We'll add an entry point, and what we're going to do is run, we'll just do cat home test user 1 test.txt. And so since I'm doing the entry point in this particular syntax, it is running just the shell command -c and feeding it cat home test user 1.txt. So we'll build a new image. We'll do user test 3 here. I guess I should, we'll call this WORKDIR test 1. We'll inspect this image real quick. WORKDIR test 1, pipe to JQ. Look at the whole thing here. And one thing, this is kind of outside the scope here, you can see the history of layers in this image, which I think is kind of nifty. When you look at the UBI piece that this image is being built off of, we see our user, test user 1. That's what this is going to run as. There is our entry point. The actual configuration is using test user 1 as well, which is exactly what we expect. So now let's try to run a container with this. We'll just have it run once and then be destroyed. Podman run --rm. Run this against WORKDIR test1 latest, and let's see what happens. All right, so it catted that file. Cat the container file again. Ran echo, outputted that to this particular file, and the entry point cat did exactly what we expect. If we were to have run like ls-l against the home test user 1 directory, we would have found that the user and group owner of this file would be test user 1, since this instruction changed us to, maybe context isn't the right word, but effectively the context of test user 1. So we'll clear the screen and let's go a little bit further and look at how the WORKDIR directive would work. So just like I've changed my user context to test user 1, if I were to add the WORKDIR directive, let's call that WORKDIR home test user 1, then from this point, anything else that occurs in the image, it is assumed to be ran from at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. English can get a little difficult. Anyway, everything is happening from the test user 1, the home test user 1 directory. So what I could do, instead of needing to give the full path there, because I'm specifically wanting to just be working within test user 1, I could simply output that to test.txt, and the entry point, because again, the WORKDIR test user 1 means that everything that we are running is, we are in the directory test user 1. This should, famous last words in IT, work. So just to show that it will be, here's a test file with WORKDIR. So we'll build our image. We'll call this WORKDIR test 2, and let's run a one-off container. And it catted the file out exactly as we expected it to do, even though, you actually see the instruction here, we did not tell it the full path to test. We have worked that out within the WORKDIR, and I believe you would be able to see that in your image inspection as well, so we can verify that. Podman inspect, WORKDIR test 2, and within the configuration we see where it's going to be running its items from. So the last thing I'm going to go over, and this will probably take the most of the time, is that understanding security related topics. So first, let's take a look at what's actually happening from a process perspective when a container is running. So we're going to start an HTTPD container. We're actually going to run this in the background. We'll do RM when we're done dealing with it. And we'll give it a name, web server 1. And we're going to run the HTTPD latest. And that gives us our container here. Now, a container is going to be a process, and all of these, one of the things that makes containers what they are is the idea of your control groups and the fact that for this container process, it has access to these finite resources from your container host, which in this case is this RHEL 8 VM. This is not new and specific to Podman. This is just how containers work. It's how it worked with Docker. And then before there was Docker, you had LXC. And of course, these other technologies are still available. And I think you can trace it all the way back to BSD gels. I haven't played with BSD, so I couldn't really tell you the technical details of that. But I just know that's kind of a part of the history. So there is going to be a process for this container. I'm going to inspect the container real quick. Now, I want to think it is it state or is it status? Let's try nothing in status. Okay, there's state. It actually tells you the process that this is that this is running as. So let's do PSAUX. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's the PID or common PID, but we'll just take a look at PSAUX and we'll list that out. Okay, that kind of makes sense. So PID is 6052 and then 6041. So 6041 looks like where I have called the container, and 6052 is the process that's actually running in the background. And notice the user for this. This user is, what would that be? 101,000, right? So rather than it showing, my user, it does show my user for the running of the Podman stuff to actually make the container. But the process that is being run by this container is owned by the 101,000 user. And then other child processes are also owned by that user. So the question becomes, all right, so where does this come from? Well, my user account on this VM, Eddie, actually has a set of UIDs and GIDs that are allocated to the processes that are made by or I guess I should say probably obviously processes here, you see more than one, but they are allocated to a particular container that is being run. So let me go into Etsy and I'll show you this a bit. There's Etsy sub GID and sub UID. Let me less sub UID. And for my user account, actually let me clear this and cat it since it's small. And so for my user account, Podman will, for non-root processes in the container, and I'll get to that in a moment, Podman is going to randomly assign a user ID for the process that could start at 100,000, and there are 65,000 different UIDs that it could potentially use. For example, we had the one container here, web server 1. I'm going to run another container. We'll call it web server 2. And let's see what happens with the PID. I think it's going to change. All right, so let's inspect web server 2. So 6580, 6569. Was that the same as web server 1? Let's take a look. No, it was not. So it's 6501 and 6041. Looks like it's actually using the same. Okay. I was thinking it would give it a different process owner, but perhaps not. And there may be situations where there would. That's outside of my my level of knowledge with how Podman functions. Maybe I need to know a little bit more about that for the exam, perhaps. But I think the idea is just knowing what that is going to map to. Now, one thing you can do in addition to seeing your PIDs here, you can take a look at Podman top. And we have the container to look at. Web server 1. This gives you some information about the container and what processes are running on it. PID 1 is HTTPD and such. You can also do user, and we see that the user that it's running as is default. You can do HUser for the host user, and that's where you see that mapping. So all of the processes that are running as this container, these are the processes within the container. They are owned by username default, and the mapping of the default user back on the host system is 101,000. Am I saying that right? 101,000? Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. My brain's not functioning well this evening. And thus, on the host system, as we see with PSAUX, that shows the process owner as that. Now, notice this is not the root user. Root's going to be a little bit different. And let's see how I can demonstrate this. Let me make, I'm in Etsy. I'm sure, why is this not tab completing? All right, container file. We're not going to add a user. Actually, we'll make this real simple because this is going to be running as root. We're going to run just the sleep command. I think sleep is in seconds, so let's give it 60 seconds in a minute, 10 minutes. Run sleep 600. So kind of a worthless container, but it'll make the point. So we'll build the sleep test image. And some of you watching have probably figured out my mistake. It is doing exactly what I told it to do, and that is run the sleep command for 10 minutes. So let's go back to our container file. I want that to actually be the entry point, not the command from the image. That was silly. There we go. Now we have an image. Let's run a container. Run it in the background. Kill it when we're done. We'll name it sleep test 1. I have to give it the image. Okay, so Podman PS, let's do Podman top on sleep test 1. We see it's running just one process, and it is running as the user root. So let's take a look at the mapping, the user mapping for sleep test 1. So notice root is actually mapped to user user 1000. So let's take a look at the process ID that this is using. So Podman inspect. Wasn't expecting that. So it should give us a process ID unless it's not running. No, it's running. Oh, PSAUX. Let's see if we can find it. This should be it, because this is the process that was running on the container. And notice that it's the user owner, user 1000 on the system is just my user account. So in the container, when we are running the process itself as root, that is not the same as the root user on your host system. As you can see here, the process is running as the user Eddie. Now, if I were to do this, see, let me get out of less. Actually, I'm going to stop all of these images. This will take a moment because that sleep thing is going to try to stop it gracefully, and it's not going to be able to. Then it'll send sigkill. Also, all of those images should be gone. Yeah. All right. So now we're going to do sudo podman run -d rm. We'll call it sleep 2. I understand why that is, because it doesn't know the name of that image. So Podman images, that's going to be in my, well, this might not work the way I was wanting to show the example of it. Basically, if I run if I were to run a container with sudo, then the actual container process is going to be owned by root and running as root. And that's the thing to take away as far as, rootless containers. What that means, or at least from what I understand that it means, is both the container process itself is not run as root. So I would not be using sudo and podman run on and on and on. Also, it means that the user within the container that is running the process is also not root. Or at least that is my understanding of what rootless containers means. From a security perspective, and this goes back to what the objective is, the less things you have running as root, the generally more secure it's going to be. Especially if you're not running the actual container process as root, you're just running it as your user process, which is what we saw before, and then the user is mapped to your sub UID. And then if you're running the process as you, but the process in the container is root, that is still mapped just to your user account. It is not mapped to the user account it's not mapped to root on the actual host system. So the last thing I did want to mention is you can change the pool of sub-UIDs and sub-GIDs. You may be able to edit the file itself, but I do know you can use usermod for that. So I think I have to use sudo for this, but we'll do usermod Eddie, and what is it? It's I knew there's like an add sub UID. I think it's dash, it's not dash Z, dash V's maybe for that. But I could add sub UID. Let's see how this works. It should be start and end. So we'll do 300,000 to 300,400. Let's see what happens here. Of course, I had a syntax error. Oh, it needs to be dash. Okay, that makes sense. Cat Etsy sub UID. All right, we see another range there. Now, one thing to keep in mind if you make this change, there's a command you need to run, which I believe is Podman. Oh, what is it? See if I can remember this without needing to check out the man page. Bah. Well, that's why you have your man pages. So if you're like this on the exam and you get stuck, you can get the information you need. It's Podman system. Yep, Podman system upgrade. Or so I thought. Maybe that's not what I was. System migrate. That was it. Podman system migrate. Now, apparently that would like restart your containers, I think, which generally, wouldn't be a bad thing because these are immutable. But I think if you get, I'm not sure how that would work if you were to update the Podman packages, if you have to do Podman system migrate, I would imagine probably so. But for this particular discussion, this is now going to make this other set of sub UIDs available for you to be able to use. And you can also alter the sub GIDs for the user account because, on RHEL, when you make a user, your primary group is a group by the same name. So let me take a look at the objectives real quick. There are only 3, but we'll see if anything comes to mind for this practice session. I think we handled that in the security related topics, albeit it was a bit scatterbrained, but I did talk about the concept of the rootless container. So I think for the exam, I'm fairly confident with this. I'm not a master of this by any means, but I'm fairly pleased with it. So hopefully you've found this useful or probably not entertaining, probably kind of boring talking about this. But if you did enjoy it, make sure you click like. I do want to thank returning subscribers for watching another video, as well as if you are watching and haven't subscribed, to click the subscribe button, and I will see you the next time.